Good evening and welcome to The Right Side. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this is the show where we look at the news and controversial topics from an admittedly conservative point of view. This evening, we're joined by Richard Geno, who's one of the founders of the Conservative Forum here in Mountain View, which is an underwriter of the show, and he'll be telling us a little bit about what conservatism means to him. Richard, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your conservative roots. Was your family conservative, or when did you find out you were afflicted with the conservative bug?
Well, actually, on the contrary, my entire family was Democrat, and except I had one grandmother who was a Republican, but she never talked about politics. And between my father and mother and my sister and my cousins and my aunts and uncles, everybody was Democrat. We were from San Francisco and pretty much a union family, so there was no conservatism in my roots.
So they were not conservative Democrats; they were more from the liberal
just the union,
side.
And it was just supporting unions, and that pretty much labeled them.
Okay.
And it wasn't as much liberalism back in the 50s and 60s as there is today, as a philosophy. It was just kind of a bunch of parts, and they were the union part.
Okay.
And,
so when did you break away from that mold?
Well, what happened is I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and entered as a Kennedy Democrat, and I left as a Reagan Republican. So it was a conversion made then. And the funny thing about it then, a lot of people talk about Berkeley as being kind of a liberal place, but in the truth of the matter is I attended classes there for 4 years, and I never once heard any professors espouse liberal ideology or any particular things we're going to do about the left of the spectrum. However, the students, where some of my fellow classmates were Jack Weinberg and Mario Savio, and you may recall, at least reading in the history books, the free speech movement. And what I later found out is the free speech movement was there to establish free speech for them, not for everybody else.
So are you saying that free speech and tolerance and all of that is not unidirectional, or is unidirectional?
Yeah, it was just an excuse to get their cause out there and have their radical theories espoused. And all you have to do is ask Ann Coulter and David Horowitz and Michelle Malkin about it today to see how free speech it is for conservatives to speak on college campuses.
Absolutely. Well, what's refreshing to know is that at least currently, it sounds like the biggest club at the Berkeley campus currently is the Young Republicans.
Right.
And so that's an interesting thing to say. And so help us understand what that date range was that you were attending Berkeley. Give or take a couple of years if you'd like.
Well, I entered in 1960 and I graduated in 1964.
Okay. And
it was in the fall of 1964 that I was in training for my career, and I was in Berkeley. So I went. My manager thought I was antisocial because he kept asking me to go to lunch with him. Instead, I went up to the campus and sat on the stairs of Sproul Hall watching Mario Savio stand on top of a police car as it unfolded. And there were more people gawking like me than there were participating. It was really entertainment. It wasn't, nobody took it too seriously back in 1964, but except Mario Savio and about 20 other people who were making a big show of themselves.
Okay. So I'm assuming Mario, forgive me for not knowing that part of the history, was from the left?
Yeah, you might say that.
So they've been disrespecting police cars not just since Occupy Wall Street, but all the way back into the 60s.
No question about it.
So, so you were actually, you said you left as a Reagan Republican before Reagan was president.
Yeah,
even,
way before he was governor.
Way before.
And I remember clearly back in the day when he was doing a General Electric Theater, 20 Mule Barracks show, and his voice caught my attention first of all, but everything he said won me over. I mean, he was just a natural political factor of my life. Then he delivered in 1964 a Vision for America, which was probably his most famous speech ever. And he did it on behalf of Barry Goldwater. Now, of course, I had already been brainwashed in the fact that Barry Goldwater was not so good because of my being on the college campus and my family and everything else. But boy, I fell in love with Ronald Reagan that night when I heard his talk. And from then on, I was a devotee to him. And 2 years later, he ran for governor of California, and I worked on his behalf. And then in 1970, I was the city chairman for Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign. And one of my proudest moments is I met him and shook his hand. I've got that picture that I use occasionally, Reagan and my shaking hands at a fundraiser, which of course I was invited because I was a young Republican, and but I wasn't a big fun giver.
Well, a lot of us are active in ways that we can be, but not necessarily that way. So you mentioned Reagan being instrumental as one of your conservative kind of posts that you could lean upon. Were there any other individuals that you can look back through the years and say, yes, that particular person I was a fan of, or their ideology or what they stood for was important, impactful to me?
Yeah, there were two. They're extremely impactful. The first was William F. Buckley, who had a program called Firing Line, and it was on KQED, the public radio, public television, and I never missed it from back in the 60s and 70s.
They had conservatives on public television at that time?
They did, and he was kind of the creator of the new conservative movement that started in early 1960s, and changed the word conservative from meaning kind of stodgy and holding back and being conservative in the definition of the dictionary, but becoming a philosophical belief system of limited government and fiscal responsibility. And William Buckley was probably my first hero, even before Ronald Reagan. And I never missed Firing Line. It was whenever I could watch it, I watched it. And it was like a lot of shows you get on HBO. It was repeated often, so if you missed it at a certain day, it would be the next day.
Okay.
And then the second one, and by the way, I did a little research recently on William Buckley. He had, and over a period of 33 years, from 1966 to 1999, he had 1,504 episodes of Firing Line. And for 33 years it ran. And the second person, which was actually before both William Buckley and Ronald Reagan, was Paul Harvey. And I don't know if you recall his staccato voice, but I first listened to Paul Harvey in 1957 when I was working. My father was a paint contractor in San Francisco, and I did summer jobs working for him. And at 12 noon, we broke sharp, and we had the radio on, listening to Paul Harvey. And I didn't know Paul Harvey, and I didn't know Republican or conservative or any of that stuff. I just knew Paul Harvey had a message, and he just was fantastic, and his message was spectacular. And he was on for 58 years on the radio, the Paul Harvey Show. And everybody thinks of what do you call it, the rest of the story. Have you heard of that? And that didn't start until about 30 years later, in the 70s or 80s. So he had the Paul Harvey News, and every day I would listen to Paul Harvey. I must have heard thousands of Paul Harvey shows.
Wow.
12 noon every day on KGO radio.
It's amazing how these things stick in someone's mind. So we're, of course, in a friendly environment, and using the word conservative here is okay, and it's not meant in any pejorative kind of way, as it might be when used in the mainstream media as an example. But tell me a little bit about your feelings about that label being a sign of conservative versus liberal, or red state versus blue state, conservative versus progressive. How do those things resonate with you?
Well, they don't resonate very well in terms of pure discussion. Unfortunately, because they are terms that we all understand, I use them also. I mean, red state, blue state, conservative, liberal. However, I look at the spectrum a lot differently. Basically, and you could call it left or right, but I'll just call it left because of the way you got to list them across the spectrum. On the far left, you have what I would call a government control.
Sure.
To
Tyranny.
the far right is freedom. And so on the far left, you have communism and fascism. And this is where government's totally in control. They dictate everything in your life, and they live by fear. And they operate by fear. And so if you step out of line like they did in Joseph Stalin's days or Mao Zedong's early days, you don't wake up the next day. And so that's what we have on the far left. And then as you move a few steps to the right, you have socialism, which is, I call it communist light. And basically it's a system where the government is controlling more and more of the operations of the country, and you can have, I guess, in a utopian world, you could have a democratic socialism, but I have never seen it work yet. But socialism is a government where it dictates an awful lot of what we do and how the system works. It also leads to some of the things we're seeing today, like crony capitalism, where the government decides the winners and losers, and that's no way to go. It breaks up competition and it ruins everything. As you move a little bit more to the right, and this is where I find that we're maybe a little bit today, because the word is being ruined, unfortunately, is democracy. But we now have a tyranny of democracy, and where you have the majority, the tyranny of the majority, where you actually have a majority of the people are recipients of benefits in our society.
That's true.
And sadly, statistics say that 47% of the population pays no federal income taxes at all. So if you're now a recipient of the benefits and you're not paying taxes, why wouldn't you vote for more benefits and higher taxes? Yeah. You're not paying them anyway. So you're not paying taxes, so what does it cost you to raise them? So we got more takers than makers. It's a very dangerous position for our country. And I fear that we're going to be in a tyranny of the majority where the top 10% pay the whole freight, and it's not going to hold up forever. And I remember learning in economics back 40 years ago is that you have to have a broadness of a base of taxpayers.
Sure.
And now it's getting smaller and smaller. And as you hear the talk of government, they're always talking about taxing the rich more and more, and they're paying 35% of the taxes in the top 5% anyway.
Right.
So that's sad. As you move further to the right, you have progressivism and liberalism, and that's kind of where we are today, I think. Then as you move further to the right, you have a Republican form of government with limited government, which I would prefer.
Right.
And as you move further on, you have libertarianism, where the government is minimized and we just do what's absolutely essential. And then if you go all the way to the far right, you have anarchy. And anarchy eventually ends up in a totalitarian form of government, because the government has to step in and break up the damage being done by a wild mob, if you will. So that's the way I look at the spectrum, and not left and right, but it's going to, if you draw it on a picture on a piece of paper, it's left and it's right. But my left is the control of the government. And a lot of people want to blame fascism and Nazism and put that in the far right, but it's all the same. It's all the government.
Well, what's interesting is your model of the spectrum is more in line with mine, as opposed to the model that we typically discuss in the country of left versus right, left being communism, right being fascism, as you said, but that's more the European model. Yeah. And what people don't accommodate for is that the United States is a unique beast in the whole political spectrum of the world. We are different than everyone else, and so to measure us on the same standard is actually inaccurate. Yeah. And so I'm glad to hear that you are seeing things similarly to the way that I see them. So looking at that and looking at how small it seems to me that piece of the right-hand side is, in your estimation, what do you see as the future of conservatism in the United States, and what kind of challenges do you see that might pop up to derail that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm always eternally optimistic, and hopefully that things will work. But unfortunately, a lot of things are out of our control. Sometimes we elect alleged conservatives, and we get things like EPA, which came in the Nixon administration, Earth Day, and we get Supreme Court Justices Harry Blackmun. We get, and then in recent years under George W. Bush, we got Medicare prescription drugs. We get No Child Left Behind, and massive deficits. And that's not my definition of conservatism.
Well, that's where I think people get confused about what is republicanism versus what is conservatism. We see, even within the Republican Party, there are major fights happening right now on how conservative or how moderate things are, which tend to actually be very progressive. And so I agree, there could be challenges there.
Yeah, we've set up a government intentionally, I think really in full force since the 60s, with a small 8-year reprieve with Reagan in the 80s, early 80s. But it's been pretty continuous since the 1960s, where we set up a system that robs from Peter to pay Paul. and leaving the fact that the government always can count on the support of Paul. And now they've gone one step further under the Obama administration, and that is they're now creating more Pauls. And so now you can always, count on getting the support of people who are on the receiving end if you keep promising more and more.
Right. And one of the founding fathers had a quote about that, about the constitutional republic will be okay until people start understanding they can vote themselves.
Right.
Riches.
And that's happening today.
So when we talk about this right versus left thing, and we start talking about right-wing extremists, and the Tea Party comes up, and they've been labeled as racist homophobes by the media, although it's not necessarily the case. What are your thoughts on the Tea Party, and have you ever been a card-carrying member?
I don't know if there are card-carrying members.
There aren't.
The Tea Party, in my opinion, is the second American Revolution. And it's really against the same forces that we had in 1776. And that was that we had a dominant government who was in control of our lives as colonists in those days, and we had to rebel. And I think the same thing is happening today. We have a dominant government, which has really been going on most of the 20th century. It started with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and continued with, especially with Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. And now the period on the whole thing is being put on by Barack Obama. So we've got a system that is out of control, and the Tea Party is doing nothing but trying to stop that. That's all. And the funny thing about it is the labels thrown around. I can remember when it first started. By the way, I've been involved. I spoke at I was one of the keynote speakers each of the last 3 years at the major Tea Party rally in San Jose in 09, 010, and 11. And I remember the first year, Nancy Pelosi, who was the Speaker of the House at that time, referred to us as, what did she say?
What was that, when she was calling people teabaggers, or what?
No. It was AstroTurf.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And so AstroTurf is something that's just kind of fake and made up, and I think she was used to that because that's what the Democrats do. They back up their trucks and buses, and they bring people into town from all over the place with their union people and give support to things that they don't really have support of.
Right.
So they couldn't imagine that we would really be impromptu and just come out and show up. And so that passed away. And then I remember the president was saying, what Tea Party? I don't know anything about it. He was like as if it didn't exist. And all that was in the face of the fact that on April 15th, 2009, in 800 cities around the country, 1.2 million people showed up, most of whom had never been involved in any political activities ever. So it's something that was spontaneous. The other thing about it is, you tell me, how is fiscal responsibility, limited government, and free markets, how is that a right-wing cause? No. That is what our country was founded on. That's what's made us successful for 230 years. Yeah. And that's all the Tea Party wants. The Tea Party, and all these socials, they called us racist, they called us violent. Those things went away because they weren't true. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, they were none of those things. We don't have any issues for social issues. It's all about free market system, limited government, and fiscal responsibility. Yeah. Agreed. Those are the only issues that the Tea Party ever had.
Well, we've got about a minute and a half left in this segment. So what I wanted to just quickly get your views on is the Republican primaries, and we're down to about a minute, so we'll have to, and tell me about how you're feeling about that and what the outcome will be.
Well, I've had several favorites over last year, from Michelle Bachmann to Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and I've really settled on one, and that's ABO. Anybody but Obama. He is just doing everything in his power to destroy this country as I see it. He's destroying the fabric that was built on the free enterprise system, and liberty and freedom are going out the window.
Well, it's interesting tying back to that 1776 reference. Yeah. I tormented one of my kids when we were waiting for the 4th of July fireworks last year by reading the Declaration of Independence with him, and it's amazing how many of those same grievances are in existence today. Yeah. But we do have to go into a word from the Conservative Forum. Thank you very much for sharing this part, Richard, and we'll be right back with you in just a moment.
Thank you.
say, well, I say I'm a constitutional law attorney. And they say, oh, really? What kind of constitutional law attorney? I say, well, I'm the true kind, the kind that believe that the Constitution is what the Constitution says and what it was intended to say. Anything beyond that is tyranny and should not be allowed.
So it's come to this, my friends. You ready the second American Revolution against a ruling class that simply lectures but does not listen or defend the American people? It is government versus the people. Am I right? Look at the Electoral College example, right? A leftist popular challenge to states' rights. You think the founders weren't brilliant people? Did they not know what they were doing by carefully calibrating to get the small states and the big states to come together? Why does Wyoming get 2 senators in California? Actually, I'd rather have Wyoming's 2 senators.
So, Richard, now we switch gears and you put on your Conservative Forum hat, and the disclaimers that have been given by our previous guests from the Conservative Forum was all things before this point were strictly your property and your opinions. Now you're speaking on behalf of the Conservative Forum. Tell us who's coming up next and how we can find out more information.
Okay. Well, first of all, we meet on the first Tuesday of every month. We meet in April. We'll have Brian Sussman, who just finished his new book on the meteorologist. He's a meteorologist, and he's going to be talking about climate change and man-made global warming and the fraud thereof. In May, we're going to have David Horowitz, and then in June and July, we have Tom Tancredo, who's a former congressman. In the fall, in the September, we're going to be having John Funn from the Wall Street Journal, and then in October, we're going to have Jesse Lee Peterson from Southern California, and he's had some run-ins with Jesse Jackson, so it should be a firecracker meeting. Okay. So we have a monthly meeting, every meeting that's the first Tuesday of the month. We meet at the Portuguese Hall, 432 Stearland Road, Mountain View.
Okay. And give us the website.
Conservativeforum.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Richard.
TheConservativeForum.com.
TheConservativeForum.com. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
And in closing, what I'd like to share with you is a segment that some people might think that should be named Keep Your Ovaries Out of Our Wallets, but I would prefer to call Keep the Fluck Out of Our Church's Business. And of course, when we speak about keeping the fluck out of the church's business, we're referring to Sandra Fluck, spelled F-L-U-K-E, but pronounced Fluck, and her speech last week to Nancy Pelosi's group when she was talking about the fact that women are suffering and dying because of lack of contraception provided by church or faith-oriented health insurance plans. Let me let her speak for herself for a moment, and I'll be right back with you.
On a daily basis, I hear from yet another woman from Georgetown or from another school or who works for a religiously affiliated employer, and they tell me that they have suffered financially, emotionally, and medically because of this lack of coverage. And so I'm here today to share their voices, and I want to thank you for allowing them, not me, to be heard. Without insurance coverage, contraception, as you know, can cost a woman over $3,000 during law school. For a lot of students who, like me, are on public interest scholarships, that's practically an entire summer's salary. 40% of the female students at Georgetown Law reported to us that they struggled financially as a result of this policy.
Sandra. First of all, we apologize that Rush Limbaugh called you a slut in the last couple of weeks. That's not the kind of nomenclature that I would choose to use to describe a scenario like that. But for any young college student that's looking at going into law, and they can find a place where 40% of the women are struggling financially because of there being so much love in the air at a university. This is almost like a Georgetown recruiting video, if you ask me. Now, the reality is, I'm a Catholic. Many of us Catholics don't care if you have contraceptives available for you. We may draw the line at abortion. We don't care if you use birth control, but we just don't want to pay for it. The bigger issue for us is one of religious liberty. And when the government is telling us or the church that it has to go against its own beliefs to support your sexual appetite, this is offensive to us. What's next? Having Michelle Obama add to the Get Moving program that our Jewish friends and our Muslim friends have to serve ham sandwiches inside their places of worship, and then the compromise being, okay, no, you don't have to serve them inside the temple or the mosque, but you do have to have them available in the parking lot. This makes absolutely no sense to us at all, and this is why you're being fought on religious freedoms, not on your ability to have $3,000 of sex over the next 3 years. The real issue, though, that you should be aware of is we know who you are. We know what this is about. You are an activist. And as an activist, we know that you're trying to distract us from the real issue, which is that the economy is in the tank. Nice try. It won't work. We understand what's important. Our beliefs are important. We will fight you on the religious liberty issue, but we want to get back to business to talk about what's really driving the country into the toilet and all of us into tyranny. On that note, thank you for joining us on The Right Side this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.